The following is a production of the University of Minnesota.
So I want to thank you for coming to our presentation, and I also want to take note of the fact that as we talked through our presentation, it shifted slightly from the title that's printed in your program. Part of this is a reflection of the fact that we're trying to talk about the curriculum that internationalizes the student, and you'll see as we go through our presentations, we're talking more and more about intentional curriculum that teaches the student how to be more internationalized. So with me here in front of the room are Tara Harvey, who is a doctoral student in comparative international development education. Myself, also a doctoral student, a candidate now in CIDE, and I also work for SIT Study Abroad as their Midwest representative. And Dr. Naomi Ziegler, who has graduated from the CIDE program, congratulations, even though it was in 2006, and who now works at Carleton College's, is it the Office of Off-Campus Studies? Okay. What we're going to do for you, Tara is going to kick us off with a little bit of a literature and research overview. I will present a case study about teaching assistants. Naomi will do a case study about overseas academic staff, and she will lead us then through selected findings of our sort of comparative view from our two research projects, and then we have some discussion questions. We hope to have, I'm hoping for 20, it may be 15 minutes of discussion, but we'll try to keep real tightly to our schedule. So Tara?
All right, so as Catherine said, I want to give you a little bit of background on what the literature and the research says about facilitating students' intercultural development through study abroad. And then the research that Catherine and Naomi present is going to begin to problematize that. And then we're going to have some discussion on that at the end. And we want to recognize that we're talking about intercultural learning, intercultural development during study abroad. We know that that's not the only type of learning that can happen during study abroad, but it's a very important, often assumed outcome of study abroad, and that's what we want to focus on today. Okay, so there are two major assumptions. Often these are implicit assumptions about the outcomes of study abroad, and we want to make those explicit today, especially because recent research has started to problematize these assumptions. The first is that intercultural contact is inherently good. We oftentimes assume having contact with people from other cultures is going to reduce our levels of prejudice, improve intercultural relations, and have other positive benefits like that. Another common assumption is that study abroad will promote the development of intercultural competence. We talk a lot in higher ed about wanting to promote intercultural competence and then say, so get more students to study abroad. Like those things are automatically connected. Study abroad will automatically lead to intercultural development. And we're going to talk a little bit about when that might and might not be the case today. Just for the purposes of our study, we want to say that intercultural development or intercultural competence specifically encompasses attitudes, behaviors, and knowledge to effectively communicate across cultures and interact across cultures. So the first assumption, that intercultural contact is inherently good. Alport's intergroup contact theory begins to problematize this a bit because he uncovered several conditions that need to be met or that should be met in order to help make that contact positive. As we all know, if we look at international news, not all contact across cultures necessarily leads to positive outcomes. So Pettigrew, who followed up on Alport's studies, said that intergroup contact is a necessary but insufficient condition by itself to resolve intergroup contact. Contact across cultures could actually increase stereotypes or strengthen stereotypes if it does not meet certain conditions. And one of those conditions that's highly emphasized is the importance of intergroup friendships, of having authentic, deep cultural contact, not necessarily just superficial contact. So students who are going abroad the contact that they're having with clerks at stores, with people on the street, that may not be sufficient to help them improve their intercultural competence and intercultural development. They need to have deeper, more authentic relationships with people in these cultures. Also, there's a dearth of research these days that's indicating study abroad could actually not be international or educative in certain circumstances. For example, there are a lot more shorter experiences these days. Students used to travel abroad for a year, a full academic year, possibly a semester. These days, more than 50% of students that go abroad for a short-term program, meaning less than a semester, often several weeks, or just 1 to 2 months. About 40% of students that go abroad for a midterm program, that is a semester or 2 quarters. Only 4% of students that go abroad today go abroad for a full academic year. This is added to by the marketization of study abroad, the commodification of study abroad. Higher education in general is having to meet students' needs more and more these days. Students are expected to be served like clients, and this carries over to study abroad oftentimes, where students expect to be able to have internet access while they're abroad. They expect to be able to update their blogs. They want to live in certain accommodations, and meeting those needs sometimes reduces their ability to have authentic intercultural contact. Also, true immersion is increasingly elusive for a lot of students because they have access to the internet, to Skype, to those type of things, because their needs are met rather than the needs that they think they have, rather than the needs that they may really have for true learning. It makes it more difficult for them to have an immersive experience. Also, Citron uncovered that there's a tendency for students to oftentimes form a third culture. They go abroad assuming that they are going to have these authentic intercultural friendships, but that's much more difficult. It's much more difficult for students to acculturate to the norms of their host culture. Citron specifically looked at 16 students who were studying abroad in Spain for a semester and found that they actually formed a third culture that wasn't actually really Spanish and it wasn't U.S. American. It was sort of something in between. It was this culture that this group formed together. They would maybe speak Spanglish, have Spanglish slang. They would go out at night as an American group at the times that Spaniards went out, but do it in a very American way. So students were kind of creating their own third culture that was neither the culture that they were in or the American host culture. And the result of all of these things together is that students are having less authentic cultural contact, which, as we talked about earlier, can be a problem because they might not be getting the benefits that we would hope that they would get from study abroad. And as a result, there's somewhat of a changing paradigm in study abroad. Many leading practitioners and scholars are now focusing on more of a learner-centered approach to study abroad. And they believe we need to be more intentional about facilitating students' intercultural learning. Rather than following the traditional sink or swim approach where you immerse students as much as possible and let them get what they can out of the situation, many people now believe that we need to try to facilitate that learning. We need to intervene and try to help them get the outcomes that we would like them to achieve. There are several studies that have found that learning is not automatic or experienced equally. For example, Medina found that students on a 16-week program in Mexico developed their intercultural sensitivity more than students on a 7-week program. She used the IDI to measure their intercultural sensitivity as well as interviews with the students and found that there was a big difference in the short-term and long-term outcomes. Mitch Hammer looked at AFS programs, which is a high school exchange program, and he found that the experience had a significant impact on students who were in more ethnocentric stages of denial and defense when they began the program, but students who were in minimization, actually the experience had little impact on their intercultural sensitivity. And many of our students who go abroad are actually in the stage of minimization. So if they are not moving along the continuum on their developmental intercultural sensitivity when they are abroad, there's something going wrong there, and we need to step in and try to help. Also, a recent Georgetown Consortium study, which you've probably heard about at some point today, was a very large study. They talked to about 1,300 students who went abroad, also looked at a control group, and found that females improved their intercultural sensitivity more than males. Males actually regressed mathematically. It was not statistically significant, but males regressed in their IDI scores during their time abroad as opposed to females who made greater gains. Also, there are several studies that suggest now, that say specifically that we need to try to mentor or facilitate students' learning during their time abroad. One of the earliest studies was done by Laubscher, who said that students had trouble converting their experience into understanding. Experiential learning theory says students need to have an abstract, a concrete experience, but then reflect on that in order to turn that into new understanding and new knowledge. Well, Laubscher found that students were not able on their own to take that concrete experience, reflect on it, and turn that into new understanding. So he started to call for help, facilitation in getting students to move through the experiential learning cycle. Also, the Georgetown Consortium project that I mentioned previously had several very important findings related to this situation. The first is that students who received mentoring often to very often showed the greatest gains in intercultural sensitivity. That was self-reported. Students said, I've received mentoring often, very often, never, or seldom. And the ones who received some sort of mentoring showed statistically significant gains on the IDI compared to those who didn't. Another important finding was that students who were challenged, but not so much that they disengaged, made the most progress on the IDI. For example, students who said that they were in dissimilar or somewhat dissimilar countries made greater gains on the IDIs than students who said they were in very dissimilar or similar countries. So the students who found the situation challenging but not overly challenging made the greatest gains. So the literature has begun to say that we should try to facilitate student learning abroad, and its suggestions is that we teach students to swim in the shallow waters, following the sink or swim metaphor, so that they have the skills, so that they can go out into those deeper intercultural waters on their own and succeed rather than flounder. We should engage students in guided reflection, dialogue, critical analysis of their experiences, and provide frameworks, like teaching them about cultural dimensions, nonverbal communication across cultures, and those type of things, so they can analyze their experiences effectively. And several study abroad interventions are now taking place, and the research on them has been quite positive. Maximizing Study Abroad, which Catherine will talk a little bit about, was developed here. It's an online course for students. It's a series of guides for students, language teachers, and program professionals. And it was studied looking at if this helped students develop their intercultural competence, and the quantitative outcomes were positive. American University Center of Providence has an on-site course that they teach to students throughout the time that they're abroad to help their intercultural competence develop, and that has also found to be a positive. And then Willamette Bellarmine is doing an online course that connects students who are studying abroad with other students studying abroad in other countries, as well as an instructor at their home campus and international students at their home campus, so that they're able to learn from their intercultural experiences with other people who are having similar experiences in similar places around the world. So I just want to conclude with this rather long, but I think very a good summary of what I've been trying to say, what the field now says about facilitating intercultural development. This is from Mick Vandenberg, who's the president of CIEE, one of the largest study abroad providers. And he says, well-trained resident directors are like talented swimming coaches. They understand that students need to learn to swim in the deep end of the pool and to do so on their own. They also understand that throwing students into the deep end when they arrive doesn't work for most of them. They've seen some who've drowned outright and too many others who have desperately dog paddled to the shallow end. There, in safe waters, these frightened swimmers congregate with others who've had trouble in deep water, frequently reminding each other of how unpleasant it is out there. For the remainder of their time in the pool, they stay close together in the shallows, doing all they can to avoid the deep end. Accomplished resident directors have learned to introduce most students into shallower parts of the pool. They work with the students throughout the program, helping them learn new ways to swim and throwing them a lifeline or swimming out to them when they're getting into trouble. As students become more aware and reflective and start to swim with skill and ease, they move into the deeper parts of the pool. The great majority of the students I've met abroad do want to swim in these deep cultural waters. They simply need an effective resident director to help them get there. So that's what the research and literature is saying that we need. And Catherine and Naomi are going to present some research that begins to challenge those issues.
Okay, deep breath. Second part of the presentation, we're making some progress. This is reporting on an ethnographic case study that I did of my own experience as a teaching assistant for maximizing study abroad. I think in this audience I don't have to go into a lot of description of maximizing. It was a semester-long online course taught to students at the University of Minnesota. It went on for about 2 years before shifting into something else. I'm going to report about the first 2 years of the project because that's the only part I TA'd. It was required of all students who were attending University of Minnesota's own study abroad programs. And briefly, it was intended to give require reflection of the students. So about 2 weeks into the program, they would have a reflective exercise about their language skills and their cultural learning skills. And another 2 weeks later, we'd have an online reflective exercise, and so on and so forth, to build that reflection in while they were having the experience so they would have a more effective outcome. This was a mixed methods ethnography. I had electronic field notes of my own interactions with the students, about 405 of them, as well as journals. This was triangulated with document analysis from training sessions that we had as a TA cohort and handouts that we prepared, that were prepared for us for learning how to be better TAs. Comparison of iterations of the syllabus as we worked at it each semester of this 2-year period to try to make it more effective with the students while still conveying the learning goals that Dr. Page and Dr. Cohen had set out for the project. And we also created some supplemental online assignments, I guess you would say, as we went through the process of teaching and learning how to teach. Then I did an online survey of the TA cohort, to which I got about an 83% response rate, and semi-structured interviews, oral interviews with key informants. The teaching assistant cohort was primarily graduate students in international education here, mostly doctoral students, some of them master's students who were also professionals over at the Learning Abroad Center. All of us were required to take a course in intercultural training and education as part of either the MA or the PhD program, although I note that not all of us had taken that course when we began our work as TAs for the course. You'll see from the other bullet points up here that it was a pretty interculturally competent group. I'm not going to read those for you. All of us had had significant overseas and language learning experience. Most of us had prior college level advising or international advising or intercultural training experience, but few of us had very much teaching experience. Some of us had about a year or two of teaching English as a foreign language, or teaching, I should say, our native tongue as a foreign language. Not all of them were ESL instructors. I want to point out that there were some hypotheses behind the MAXA course, that there's a strong correlation between second language acquisition and cultural integration. We assumed that students will learn more effectively if they receive skill-specific mentoring and language and cultural learning abroad. That strongly has come out of Dr. Cohen's work, but also Dr. Tyrone's work, I think, in, SSBI. It's not, it's Dr. Cohen? Okay. Strategies and skills-based instruction, I think it stands for. It's been a while since I did all the research. We also assume that the students have chosen to study abroad because they want to have successful language or cultural learning experiences. And certainly that's what they tell us, their professors and their study abroad instructors, although sometimes you have to wonder, since they don't effectively put that into practice. Student assumptions that we found throughout the teaching of MAXA, as well as it's also in the literature. And we do have handouts with these literature and references that we'll give you after the presentation. Students assume that immersion learning means easy language acquisition, that experience is the same thing as learning, that travel, because it's an experience, is the same thing as learning, and that cultural learning occurs automatically by combining language and travel. This has been called the magic carpet syndrome of language and cultural learning. Since it was a required course, they also thought it was probably worthless, or why would we have made them take it? This resulted in what you might call some classroom management issues. Not every student wanted to participate in maximizing study abroad. I myself remember getting emails from students, well, I've studied abroad before as a high school student and I'm really very interculturally competent, and can you just give me a pass on the course? There were also students who were learning in what you might call full language immersion environments, which is to say maybe they were going to a German university doing all their coursework in German, and it really bothered them to have to sit down and write to a TA in English as part of their reflective exercise. So there were problems in trying to get the students to engage in the learning, even though we felt that we had learning goals that were congruent with their professed learning outcomes, shall we say. Finally, since this was graduate work, I wanted to find a theory that I could ground it in that could sort of drive me to understanding my own teaching experience and that of my colleagues in the course. Watsky's developmental theory is about beginning language teachers. You find the reference to the article in my notes. And Watsky says that no matter what you teach the language teachers, I would broaden this to say language and culture teachers, because MAXA was really both things and you can't unpack them very well. What they end up doing in the actual teaching experiences is what worked for them as a learner. It's also based on their attitudes toward how disciplinarian you have to be to get the student to comply. It's based on the instructional goals for a specific lesson, and also how you manage the student's expectation and keep them motivated. It's a very interesting article. I recommend it highly. What I found through my ethnography is for these teaching assistants, effective teaching was relationship building. It was therefore constrained by the lack of any face-to-face bond with the student. We never met the students. We introduced ourselves over email. We assigned assignments over email. We sent grades by email. Never met the students. It was totally an email interface. Some TAs said had problems with not being able to see which students were getting it, which students were goofing off, as you can in a physical classroom, and do more to get that student to engage. And all of them said that they define their role not so much as a teacher, certainly not as a disciplinarian, but more as a co-learner, a mentor, a tutor, a therapist. That therapist is a direct quote from one of the TAs. I found also that the TAs were subject to magic carpet syndrome themselves, to not wanting to take the student away from that immersion experience. So maybe if there was an assignment that that the student turned in that sort of covered the bases, and you thought that they more or less showed that they were learning, okay, you'd give them a pass for that. I mean, count that as a pass, count that as a fulfillment, rather than maybe challenging the student to go a little deeper with his or her observations. So I think we thought that experience was actually trumping reflection, even though we had been taught that reflection was necessary to experiential learning. We sort of satisficed, because we didn't want to put too much demand on the student and take away from that experiential learning. I have some TA quotes here. I think in the interest of time, I won't read them to you. This will be, of course, posted to the website, and you can go back and reflect on this experience of trying to learn about my research. Control of the classroom. This was a mandatory course, a pass-fail course. We were supposed to pass anybody who didn't turn in their assignment on, fail anybody who didn't turn in their assignment on time, and deduct points if the assignment was late. And they were highly sequential assignments, so you kind of needed them to be done at the intervals they were supposed to be done at. On the other hand, this is online learning. It requires self-motivation, and students sort of expect to be able to pop in, pop out. They weren't used to it being sort of as time-bound as we needed to have it be. The instructional goal of increased intercultural and linguistic competence really required buy-in, so you couldn't really control the classroom rigidly. Right? In an email environment, the students didn't expect you to come on like the Catholic, the instructors in a Catholic school rapping knuckles all the time, right? They expected you to be a friend, to engage with them, and you had to learn how to do that effectively. So some of the ways that the TAs were able to do this was through compliance building strategies. Building affinity, sharing your experiences, being informal, shifting the power balance, modeling good learning strategies, so reflecting on something you read from a student essay and showing the student your reflective process, for example. Foregrounding our own expertise as either intercultural learners, intercultural experts, as advisors, or as specialists in a particular cultural setting. We did have to do individualized goal setting. You couldn't necessarily expect the same level of attention of achievement of some students as you could for others. Citing the research and also giving students these sort of face-saving opportunities. Well, for some reason I didn't get your email, and I'm sure it was just that you had a power outage in Nairobi. Or maybe I lost it in my spam filter. Can you send me that email again, and I won't deduct points for it? I think. So my lingering questions. What does it mean when the instructor is prevented from engaging with the students or the material, partly because of the limitations of the instructional method, right? We wanted to make it really easy. We didn't want to go with a full online multimedia course learning methods because we didn't think students would have good access to that in Nairobi necessarily. But email really seemed to be, for some of the instructors, a barrier to the relationship building that they wanted for their teaching. And second, wouldn't this all have worked better if the intercultural swimming coach, to borrow the metaphor that Tara used earlier, were on-site with the apprentice swimmer? And that leads us, I think, into our next presentation. Thank you.
All right, well, I'm going to talk a little bit about my, my dissertation research, which was on on-site staff, so resident directors and on-site staff of study abroad programs. I picked out a few of my research questions. What kind of preparation have study abroad resident directors and on-site staff had for their role as intercultural educators? And I just wanted to underline that this is an assumption that I made kind of as the basis of the research, which we mentioned earlier too, that, I think at least in our program, in our lingo, we sort of assume this role as that resident directors have this role as intercultural educators. In my work since then, I'm starting to question that a little bit. And maybe I questioned it before, which is maybe why I came up with this topic in the first place. But I was really interested in knowing what kind of preparation on-site staff had for this assumed role. I was interested in how resident directors conceptualize the goals and processes of culture learning and study abroad, so really how they're thinking about it, how they're talking about it, how they're articulating it, models, concepts, and theories that they draw on, and then how important they feel that this priority is compared to many of the other priorities that they have to juggle in a day and in a program. And then specifically, how do they facilitate students' cultural learning in the study abroad programs? So the strategies that they use in individual interactions with students, as well as kind of on a more programmatic scale. Just to give you a little bit of idea of who I talked to in my research, I interviewed resident directors in 2 different countries, France and Senegal, so 9 in France, 8 in Senegal. They were from a wide variety of different types of study abroad programs, so nonprofit program providers. This is the CIEE, IES kind of group of study abroad organizations. U.S. universities would be a university like Tufts University or Dickinson College, or some colleges that have satellite campuses or satellite sort of programs, but with a permanent staff, a permanent operation in country. And then an independent provider would be a small study abroad organization that just runs 1 or 2 programs, for example. Program types, so I had a variety of different program types. Field-based, which was more kind of experiential, more internship focused. There were 5 of those, and hybrid was anything that had some kind of university course instruction and then some kind of study abroad center instruction. And in my sample, there were 8 individuals who were from the host country, so either French or Senegalese, and 9 who were U.S. American expatriates living in those countries. In terms of their previous experience living in another culture, 1 person only had less than a year, but 9 had over 10 years of experience. So this is a very savvy, very experienced group in terms of intercultural living experience. 9 had PhDs, 2 ABDs, so obviously a very highly educated group, as you would expect among college educators. Others with masters or at least a bachelor's, 1 with a high school. She was more of an assistant. She wasn't a resident director. She was more of an assistant on the program. I had two or 3 kind of assistants, and the rest were directors of programs. In terms of the intercultural training that they had, 4 had none. When I asked them if they'd had any kind of intercultural training experience, they said no, none at all. Some had training through their job, like they'd been a Peace Corps volunteer or had been to workshops like this. The conferences, I guess, would be more like a NAFSA conference or a CIEE conference or a conference like this. Some like more day-long intercultural training workshops, like maybe a day or 2 with like Dr. Page or Dr. Bennett, with the Institute for Intercultural Communication Institute out in Portland. And then professional experience in education, a lot, average of 26 years. This is just one of the quotes that I pulled out on formal education and training, which I thought was important because it highlights that the training that people receive really helps them put into practice, sort of give language, give words to experiences that they've had that they can sort of then translate in a practical way to work with students. And I found that everyone who had recent training was actually trying to test it out in their programs at the time that I was interviewing them. So I thought that there was definitely some value in that. And then again, just a couple quotes on informal preparation. And these, I guess, will be on the slides. So I'm sorry if you don't have time to finish reading them. In terms of models theories and concepts used. Of course, I'm, coming from all the literature that Tara presented. Well, mine was 5 years ago, so a lot has happened even in the last 5 years. But that was kind of the mindset that I was coming from. I was, trying to see what, how up people in the field were on all of this new research and things that were being written. And I found that there was quite a bit of variety. My sample kind of divided into three groups. I would say 1/3 were experience rich and theory poor, meaning that they rely primarily on their own experience, but have very limited theoretical knowledge of guiding students through an intercultural learning process. About 1/3 I called experience rich and theory limited, meaning that they had some knowledge of intercultural theory and incorporated their knowledge into individual interactions with students, but not really into the program design. And then the other third were experience rich, so they were all experience rich, but theory grounded, meaning that they could articulate the learning theories that informed their programs and give concrete examples of how they used intercultural theory in their program design in interaction with students. In terms of priority, 11 respondents, when I asked how important cultural learning was compared to other types of learning on their program, 11 said that it was central to their program. So obviously a pretty high priority was being placed on it. 2 said it was a means to another end, and 4 said that it was one competing goal among many. And then in terms of strategies for facilitation, I got a lot of answers, which I kind of divided out into or categorized into three main areas: coordinating, guiding, instructing, and interpreting. So coordinating is, doing things like kind of getting people together, maybe organizing language partner type programs. Guiding is kind of more on the individual interaction when students come and pose a problem, how helping them think through it, giving them some new, potentially different ways of looking at it based on some kind of a theory or or experience that they'd had, to try to get the student to look at the situation in a new way. Instruction is more how it is built into a classroom setting, where there's a French cultural patterns class, for example, or an intercultural communication class, or some kind of country analysis class that really gets at discussion topics based on the experiences students are having in their day-to-day life, in their homestay families, or in their internships, or in their interactions with people in stores or whatever. And then interpreting. Actually, I found a lot of interpreting going on, where the resident director was acting as kind of a cultural interpreter, trying to explain maybe what the host, if there was a problem in the host family, like some money got stolen or something. They would try to figure out what was going on and try to explain to the student maybe what had happened, or how they how money was viewed differently, or maybe that they should not leave money in their rooms, they should leave it in the program office, things like that. And then on the other side of it too, where they would do a lot of interpreting to the folks from the host culture, like say in Senegal, for example, a American student wanted to have a female student wanted to have a male student visit her, and she would say, she would invite him to stay in her room overnight, which was, and maybe it was a completely platonic friendship kind of thing, but that was viewed very suspiciously in that culture, and so the program director or the staff person would kind of explain to the host family that maybe that wasn't, wasn't the intention, but maybe they could work with the student and find them another room to stay within in their home. In terms of overall programming orientation, obviously a very logical place to put put a lot of this cultural information. Interaction with the host culture, again, setting up different experiences, paying interns, or paying other students of their own age to come give some sessions during the orientation, blending the in and out of class learning, and interaction with program staff. So having staff that were well trained, that students could kind of question or discuss their experiences with as a form of programming. So that's all I'm going to say about my research now. I think I'm going to kind of go into this, some of the selected findings from our three presentations, and then pose a couple questions. Hopefully we'll have a little time for discussion. So from Tara's presentation, I think we can say that the literature suggests that to facilitate student learning, you need to have a balance of challenge and support, guided reflection, dialogue, and analysis, and provide students with frameworks for understanding their experience in an intercultural sense. From Catherine's presentation, and these are simplified, obviously, they found other things than what I'm presenting, but found that students did not necessarily want to spend a lot of time analyzing their experiences instead of having them, that building a learning community among students in different locations was challenging, and that TAs were inexperienced teachers. From my own work, I think I can say that resident directors and on-site staff have extensive intercultural personal experience and are very experienced educators. Their preparation to be intercultural learning facilitators is very uneven, and perhaps, therefore, although I'm not sure, intentional facilitation of intercultural learning in programs varies quite widely, and there are no agreed-upon standards or conventions for how intercultural learning is enacted in study abroad programs. So as a question to the audience, I have three questions. We have three questions. Is there a consensus as a field that intentionally facilitating students' intercultural learning is a priority for study abroad? Basically, do we accept the swimming coach metaphor as proposed by Vandenberg? Is facilitating intercultural learning or competence too broad of a concept to operationalize as a goal across the field? Is this just like too much to think about? And maybe therefore, maybe not. Should we stick to more concrete academic learning goals such as language and content acquisition in our basic program design? So with those, I'll turn it to you or see if anyone has any thoughts on any one of these questions. We have 5 minutes officially left. Hopefully, maybe a few more.
There are no wrong answers.
This is also coming from, I guess, insight from being a student who I studied abroad spring of '08, and Catherine was actually my TA. So it's nice to see you.
This is great. We didn't set this up, okay?
No. It was a wonderful surprise. And I had studied in Germany, and I think just from my informal feedback from what I heard from other students on my program and other classmates was I think there was a gap between having a TA for reflections, which at first we thought it would be more of that they would be more academic assignments, as opposed to having a mentor or an advisor and someone to just talk to about these reflections. And I think a lot of us, when we first saw that we had a TA, oh, this is going to be academic, but then when we saw the assignments and went through the assignments, it felt more, since it was reflection, we felt it would be more of a dialogue thing and reflecting with someone else. But the face-to-face was missing then. And other students then were confused why it's a TA when it seems like more of a mentoring and kind of an advisor role. And that instructor part was there was a gap in the understanding of what was expected and kind of what we're actually doing, and so. But yeah, I enjoyed it.
Which semester did you take it?
Spring '08.
So that was fairly far along in our evolution of the
Yeah.
course, actually. Interesting. Thanks.
Yeah.
Do you think that that role confusion as to whether this person was really an instructor or an advisor affected the kind of effort that students put into the class? Or kind of, this expectation, well, if you don't get your work done, you fail the class. But if it seemed like more of a reflective thing, well, that maybe seems like more of a conversation you want to have or not, and it should be up to you. You shouldn't be forced to do it. Did that play in at all?
Yeah. Basically everything that you said. There were a mix of responses with that. And my roommate, she studied abroad the same semester in Nairobi, and her difficulty and the people that she studied abroad with was that the online element. And and that was difficult because they had limited access, and when they had the limited access, they wanted to spend it emailing their families or whatever and not doing an assignment online. And which they weren't really sure what the purpose of it was, because since it was reflection, then they thought, well, why don't I just write in my journal and then give it to someone when I return? And so, yeah, that was a little ambiguous, but...
Did you feel like you were having these kinds of conversations that the maximizing class was trying to stimulate on site with your friends or with folks on the program? Was it duplicative in any way?
Not all of it. I did appreciate the really having to bring out actual experiences and dig deeper.
But you were like, there were 2 or 3 students who were studying. There wasn't really a cohort there at the German university like there would have been in Nairobi. Are there any other kinds of questions? I don't...
Sorry, I don't mean to keep grilling you. But it's interesting. It's really interesting to get the perspective of someone who's been on sort of the receiving end of this work. So thank you.
I just want to say that I really appreciate the feedback that I got with each of them.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
I find it very interesting that we're focusing on intercultural competence here, and as coming at this from a language perspective, it's the interlanguage or the translingual and transcultural competence is what we're after these days, and I find it hard to separate the two. I mean, I like the idea that you're asking them to think about the processes they're going through it, but to separate just the cultural from the linguistic can be problematic too. I mean, I think to address both the linguistic and the cultural development as it's going along, it's a great idea, and it's terrific.
One thing I didn't make maybe clear enough is that the maximizing did have specific linguistic peg to cultural development along through there, and I certainly would speak not only for myself, would say as somebody who's learned about 5 or tried to learn 5 or more non-native languages, that I really was conscious about trying to connect those all through the semester, except for the kids that were in Australia.
And there are other study abroad interventions that are kind of questioning whether to do it in English or whether to do it in the host language, and are coming up with different answers, but a lot of them seem to be now tending towards doing it in the host language. And I actually spoke to people in CIE who are doing it in one place and asked the students which they would prefer, English or in Spanish in this case, and the students chose to do it in Spanish. Most of the readings are in English, and then they reflect on that, but anything that they hand in and the course itself is taught in Spanish. So they are trying to blend the two a lot. And the program that I mentioned in France, all of it's conducted in French, and they make their students sign a waiver at the beginning saying that they will only speak French.
Any other comments? I think we've gone past our allotted time, so if anybody wants to leave, that's perfectly fine.
Well, if there's no further comments for the large group, thank you for attending.
Resource This is up here if anybody wants some.
It's pretty good bibliography. I actually found several things on there that I should be reading too. Thank you.